I'm very pleased to introduce to you Mr. DeRay McKesson. Please give him a round of applause.
It's good to be here.
So, DeRay, you've just essentially come back from Germany via New York and back here.
I was in Germany, yeah. We were doing a tour of prisons in Germany. So we did a couple prisons in Hamburg, a couple prisons in Berlin to try and figure out, is there anything to learn? And it is interesting because in some ways, the prisons in Germany, they figured out how to restrict people's liberty without necessarily stripping their dignity. So you think about in Germany, for instance, most of the inmates have keys to their own cell. The privacy laws in Germany actually extend into prison. So all the doors are solid doors, no peepholes, no windows, like it is their room. So those sort of things are interesting. At one of the women's prisons, there's like a needle exchange program. So it was like a little box that looked like a box of tampons would go in, but there were needles in them. And the wardens sort of knew that drugs were banned because it's jail, but they knew that people were using and they wanted people to use in a healthy and clean way anyway. So it's those sort of things that we were looking at. And structurally in Germany, a life sentence is 15 years. So like that is like the longest sentence that people get. Whereas here, as you know, people are in jail for like 100, you can get a 100-year sentence here, which is so different than in other countries.
Right, so a lot of your story and maybe why you're here today and why you're in Germany started when you were a teacher in Minneapolis and you went to Ferguson. So can you talk us through that decision, that experience, and where you came out of that?
Yeah, I taught 6th grade math in East New York, Brooklyn, which was incredible. 6th grade is the best grade. 7th grade is puberty and deodorant, and it is rough. But 6th grade is great. And 7th grade always made me ask, like, who made Axe spray? Like, why did people make Axe spray? Because 7th graders, like, they essentially, like, drink it. You're like, what are you doing? But 6th grade was really beautiful. And when I think about that work, it was rooted in this belief that, like, kids deserve something that they weren't getting. And by the time Mike Brown got killed, I was living in Minneapolis, working for the school system. And I remember seeing this story and being like, I talk so much about this commitment to kids that the least I can do on this weekend is like go down and just see what happened because they killed a kid and his body lay in the street for 4.5 hours. So I went to St. Louis. I didn't know anybody. I put a Facebook message up saying I'm going to St. Louis. And the rest is sort of history. The second night I was in St. Louis was the first night that I was tear gassed, and I'll never forget it. It's sort of hard now to watch movies and stuff about tear gas because it glamorizes it, and there's nothing cool about being tear gassed. But I remember, if you saw us marching in the street in those early days in August, September, October 2014, it wasn't that we thought marching was a cool thing to do. It was actually illegal to stand still in St. Louis in August, September, and October of 2014. If we stood still for more than 5 seconds, we were arrested. It was called the 5-second rule. We got it deemed unconstitutional in October, but that was a long 3 months of us walking. And the police thought that they were going to tire us out. They thought that if they made us walk all day, that we'd be so tired, we'd go home. And we were like, no, if we got to walk, you got to walk. So we just walked all night and all day, and that was really wild. It was we were in the street for 400 days. Most people look back on the protests in St. Louis, and they think about it as like a really long weekend, but it was a long 400 days that we were out in the street. So it is beautiful to see the awareness that created all across the country. We still have so much more work to do.
So talk about that experience, because this conference is about taking action, whether it's small action, big action, and finding a cause. And we heard yesterday this sort of reaction to a situation that just changes you, and you might walk past this and you might walk past that, but you felt a pull to Ferguson, but then you stayed. And so some of the decision making there, like what was going on in your head, you've sort of touched on why you went, but why did you stay? Because that's the stuff, the unglamorous stuff, right? That's the stuff that doesn't get really reported on, that you stuck it out. And 400 days, why do people keep going? What was it that you thought, I need to stay here?
Yeah, we didn't know everything, but what we did know is that Mike Brown should be alive today. And we kept that simple truth with us every single day in the street, and like that was enough, right? We were like, we weren't there. We don't know for sure if his hands were up or not. We believe they were. We don't know like what conversation went between him and the officer, but we know that he should be alive today. So that was real for us. People often talk about truth and reconciliation, and they don't want to acknowledge that the truth has to come before the reconciliation. And there are a lot of people that want to get to the we should just move on to that. And we're like, no, we want to deal with the truth, you know? So us being in the street was a statement of saying that, like, we're not going to let people ignore what just happened. That, like, we know that protest isn't the answer, but what protest does is, like, force people to deal with what just happened. So when we shut down streets in St. Louis and we were, like, disrupting traffic and, like, shutting them all down, that was our, like, very small way of helping people see the disruption that our lives have been impacted by police killings. And you know, when you think about the data, it's like a third of all the people killed by a stranger in this country is actually killed by a police officer. In places like California, 1 in 11 gun homicides is committed by an officer. Like, that's wild, right? That this is actually, like, much bigger than people think. And when you think about those early days, people thought that there was a problem in Ferguson. They didn't think there was a problem in America. And now people realize that this is just much closer to them than they thought, but that was our work. So most people remember, like, Mike Brown, they remember Sandra Bland, they remember Walter Scott in North Charleston, and they remember Freddie Gray are, like, the 4 big stories that were national. Philando Castile, Alton Sterling. There have been so many. You know Mike Brown's name, but the police killed 9 people in St. Louis while we were still in the street. They killed Kajim Powell literally the next weekend, you know? So it was like this never-ending trauma, and it took all of us staying in the street to make this a story that wouldn't go away.
So you mentioned there the small acts small efforts and small acts, and it's probably not very small closing a mall down, but those things, they add up, right? And in your book you talk about that we can change the world by small acts. So what sort of successes have you seen in 4 years through these groups of small acts or individual small acts? What are some of the success stories you've seen?
When I think about, like, what it means to be a hero, when I think about what the protesters in the early days did that was really remarkable, is that we sort of just walked into the risk. We were like, we don't know everything. We know Mike Brown should be alive. Like, we don't have a playbook. We don't know the right things. We know that this is dangerous, and we don't know if we'll win. But we're going to walk into that anyway. And, like, that was, like, really important to us. And every night we came out, we were like, we don't know, but, like, we're going to stay out here because if we go home, we know that people will ignore this. So when I think about the small acts, the movement was, like, born of small acts. The first thing that I ever did in the protest was make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. And I made incredible peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, very good at it. I can't cook, but I can make a great peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And, like, that's what we did, you know? Like, we were in a kitchen making sandwiches and planning actions. Like, that's how the best organizing happens. And often it's, like, people in their living room or dining room or outside, and, like, those things really mattered. And what you saw in the news, like, the bigger things that happened, like, came out of the really small things. So when I think about 4 years later, I think that there's better language around these issues, that people are talking about police violence, mass incarceration, the racial wealth gap in ways that literally they were just not talking about before. We also know more than we did 4 years ago. So I think about, like, some of the structural things. So we created the first public database of police union contracts in the country and use of force policies. And it sounds really wonky, but what we realized was that there are a set of laws and policies that essentially just protect the police. So we were wondering, like, why are police never held accountable? Like, what's the what there? And we realized that there's some laws, like in California, there's a law that says that any investigation of an officer that lasts more than a year can never result in discipline regardless of the outcome. And we're just like, that doesn't make sense. In Cleveland, they destroy police officer disciplinary records every 2 years. That doesn't make sense. In Maryland, there's a law that says that you can file an anonymous complaint against an officer for everything except brutality. And we're like, well, that doesn't make sense, right? So we were trying to figure out, like, what is the what? And we did it, you know? The question now becomes, how do we take that awareness and make it actually change the outcomes? Because what isn't good is that the police have actually killed the same number of people every year since the protest started. Like, there's been no impact on the data. And that is really hard. And the last thing I'll say is that the data is actually really interesting, that if you get killed in this country by a police officer and a newspaper doesn't report it, then you just don't exist in the data set. Because the government actually keeps no numbers of this. So we can tell you the rainfall in Missouri 100 years ago, but literally can't tell you how many people died by police last year. Like, there's no official source. So we actually think that we're undercounting because any number you've ever heard is, like, from newspaper reports. So the Washington Post keeps, like, the most comprehensive database that most people know. Like, it's the most public database, not the most comprehensive, actually, in reality. And the challenge with their database is that they only keep on-duty killings that include a gun. So Eric Garner, the officers were on duty, but he was choked to death, no gun, so he's not in their database. Botham Jean, who you just saw, the officer went into his apartment and killed him. She was off duty and included a gun. That's not in the database. So, like, we think that that's just, like, an incomplete picture. When officers go home and shoot their wives in the head, that's not in the Washington Post database. Like, so we created a database that just has all of it in one place because we thought that was just like the most fair way to think about the data.
I need to introduce you to a Vegemite sandwich. So it's much better than a peanut butter and jelly. But we'll do that later.
Peanut butter and jelly.
So data is really interesting to me because I think conversations in this country and beyond are very much lacking in data. It's very opinion, it's very my story, or I saw this, or whatever. And you know, we see this stuff getting flooded onto Facebook with graphics and whatever. And I think the fact that we don't have the data makes it really hard to have these honest conversations and have reasoned arguments. And how can we, and in the audience and anyone watching, find the data? Because it is so biased, made up. It's really hard to find it. So have you got any ways for us to check our data, whether it's legitimate, where it's come from? How do we go about doing that, filtering through that?
So two things. One is that there's this question about like what's all the data that's already in front of you that you don't even know you're inhaling every day. So with the police, for instance, it's like you can't name 3 shows that you've seen with internal affairs, like an internal affairs department of a police department. You can't name any show where the internal affairs people aren't like the worst people you've ever seen, like the throwaway cops, like the bad guys. Like that is literally how they're depicted in every single show you see. It's like internal affairs are like the cops you hate, like they are the people nobody wants to work with. And that actually sends a message about accountability inside of police departments that people just don't think about. Even things like, raise your hand if you saw Zootopia, which is an animated film. A lot of Zootopia. Whoa, it's a lot of people saw Zootopia. Raise your hand if you saw Bad Boys, like old school Bad Boys. And then raise your hand if you saw Bright, which was a not great movie on Netflix. Okay? All of those movies are problematic in the exact same way. So what's fascinating about Zootopia is if you remember Zootopia, it's like I think she's a rabbit. She's like the main police officer. Is that somebody steals the onion, so she's trying to find the onion because the onion's like, important. And the challenge, though, is that literally in the pursuit of the person with the onion, she is just running over people's neighborhoods. There's like that miniature neighborhood. She just like runs through it. She's like destroying stuff, knocking people over. And Bad Boys, they're literally just shooting into crowds, like that's sort of wild. And in Bright, the very first scene in Bright is they're in that bodega, and then the police officer just like knocking people over. Is that like, that sends this message that like the police can sort of do whatever they want in pursuit of whatever justice looks like. And like, that is like an interesting set of data that we consume every day that people just don't even think about as a site to contest. But until we sort of contest the way that stories are told in the most public spaces, like we'll always sort of be up against a wall. The second piece is to your question directly around data is, some of the data that's the most important is stuff that hasn't been collected before. So when we are out here so for example, like we don't have any national data about sexual assault complaints against police officers. It just doesn't exist. Like there's no data at the national level. There's some places that collect it really well, but like we literally just don't have it. We have no real national data about domestic abuse by police, like all the stuff that is like really interesting that we could do something with, we're like struggling to get it. You even think, like in Baltimore, for instance, the complaint data is all on like carbon copy paper. It's like, well, that's not helpful, right? The only reason that we have good data around police killings is that the person died, and because they died, it's like we have a record of their death. But there's so much other data that we just don't actually know. So when I think about like what people can do, it's like actually ask the tough question so that we can start to like uncover some of these data elements that like we need.
So how do you, as a consumer, I see you're on Twitter a lot, and Twitter just and Facebook is full of reports and et cetera, et cetera. How do you personally vet the information? Are you looking for the masthead of the paper or the name of the website, the name of the reporter? What are some of the things we can do to get in the habit of finding information rather than opinion?
I think it starts with like, I have a complicated relationships with the platforms. I've seen like the best and worst of the platforms. The first person ever permanently banned from Twitter was banned for raising money to try and get me killed. So I've seen that part of the platform. I've also seen like the beautiful parts of having people like use their voice in ways they didn't know was possible. So like that is really cool. I follow a small number of people just so I know that if they put something on the timeline, I can generally believe it. So that's one of the ways that I sort of manage it, is just like only following people that I trust. So if they put something on, I'll be like, okay, that makes a lot of sense. I think that what is what has happened too is that more people are consuming news that never really consumed news. I think about when the protest started, I didn't even know what a Vox was. I'd never read anything in The Guardian. Like, I just hadn't done those things. And now all of a sudden, because they were covering issues that were important to us, a lot of us were paying attention differently. So I think that's real. The sort of hard thing about social media is that things move so quickly that like what might have been breaking news an hour ago, like the world, it's like, did we bomb North Korea today? I don't know. It's like on the stage, it's like, who knows what happened in that White House? And like that is actually just it's like harder to find out what is true and what is not, given how rapid things change. So I think that we're still figuring out what social media means in this moment as the world moves so quickly.
So it sounds like you're being deliberate about the people that you're consuming, but you're obviously consuming that information in a questioning way. So over time, you're saying, yeah, this person I've seen a history of trustworthy reporting, and so if these three people all say this, then it's pretty good. So you're curating which is what you're supposed to be doing, right? Curating your feed.
And trying to put myself in places where I learn new things. So I know a lot about mass incarceration and a lot of the police, those sort of things. But I read this article the other day about the Utah and DUIs. So every state in the country, the legal limit for alcohol is 0.08, which most people know. Utah is the first state in the country where on December 30th, the legal limit is going to be 0.05. It'll be the lowest limit however you think about it, it'll be the lowest threshold, the most stringent limit in the country. And like that was like somebody put the story on my timeline. I read it. I did some research. I was like, that's really interesting. And every time I read these stories, I'm trying to figure out like what the big connection is, right? So like with that, what's interesting is I didn't know that how we got to the 0.08 threshold was a federal law that when Clinton was president, it was this law that he was like, the federal government's going to withhold money for highways unless people get the threshold. The biggest opponents of the threshold being lower are actually the restaurant lobbies in Utah. They are worried that if the limit gets so low, or the limit becomes 0.05, they're worried that people won't buy alcohol at dinner anymore because they won't know like how many drinks they can have. And it's those sort of things that I'm always fascinated by. Like how can we like put ourselves in proximity to new information that we don't know? There's also like an interesting story around Obama phones. So we shouldn't call them Obama phones, but the federal government has a subsidized phone program for people in poverty or people in government assistance. And the FCC is about to cut a big part of that program. And we're actually worried about the impact on domestic violence survivors. Is that what a lot of men do is that they will ruin a woman's credit so they can't open accounts in their own names, including phone accounts. And this phone program the FCC runs has been used successfully by domestic abuse shelters to give women phones that otherwise like wouldn't be able to get them on their own because their credit has been ruined by a man who's abusing them. And it's those sort of links that I'm always interested in. Like how do we like help make connections amongst things that look seemingly disparate but actually are all about equity and justice in the end?
Yeah, fantastic. So one of the things I've seen in the book too is you really wanting to focus on building a future rather than dwelling on the past and saying this was bad, let's stop doing that, and rather build something instead of stopping something. And I think there's a lot of students here and there's a lot of people involved in anti-bullying, and I think that message of anti-bullying is very negative. Like, we're going to stop this thing happening instead of this is what we want our schools to look like. So how do you get into that mindset, and how do you convince others to say, let's paint this picture of the future? How do you do that and get people on board, and how do you convince them to do it? Yeah.
So I'd say three big things. One is that, when we talk about these issues now, I try to talk about them in the most simple terms. So people will say like, oh, DeRay, you hate the police. And it's like, I don't hate, like this isn't about like a single police officer. This is about an institution that's sort of struggling. So I was on a panel once with a police officer, and she said to me, she was like, DeRay, but people commit crimes, like you're painting with the broad brush. And she's like, are you saying that police should never kill somebody? And I'm like, well, you have kids. When should the police kill one of your kids? And she's like, I don't know. And I'm like, well, I don't know either. If you don't know for you, then like, why should another parent have to go through that? If you can't think of a scenario when your kid is going to do something that harms other people, and your kid is, everybody does something that disadvantages other people at some point. If you can't think about something that like you'd be okay with somebody shooting your kid in the head, then like nobody should have to do that. So much of our work when we talk about these things is like, how do we make sure that the other person is actually thinking deeper and we're just not giving speeches? When I talk about social welfare programs, I'm no longer like preaching about the importance of social welfare. I'm saying to people like, tell me what a 4-year-old has to do to like earn dinner. What does a 7-year-old have to do to like deserve shelter? I don't know. I think that a 4-year-old should just have breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and I don't think that's like a radical idea, you know? So how do we help like frame these things for people in a way that doesn't have us be the only people sort of preaching about it, but actually is the other person doing a little bit of work? The second is that, so much of us who are engaged in the work of justice, we are always trying to tell a story about a world that's never existed before, but we know it's possible. So when we think about a world where like the criminal justice system is actually just, or where every kid can eat, or where everybody has access to healthcare, like we've never seen that in real life before, but we're trying to tell a story about it because we know it's possible, and that's just like hard work, like telling a story about a world that you've never seen is like hard, and it takes a lot of practice, and some of what we sort of get bogged down in is that we're like, if people don't get it right the first time, they just don't get it. The third is that, when I talk to a lot of teachers, and what I always remind teachers is that like young people often have the experience before they have the language, right? So if I walk into a 6th grade classroom and I say to 6th graders, tell me about your last encounter with racism, they will be like, I have no clue what you're talking about. But if I say to them, like, have you ever felt different because of your race? Isn't it like they've had experiences, and part of our work as adults is to validate those experiences and help people build the language. And that's also true when we organize with adults, is that there are a lot of adults who like don't have the language yet to talk about racism, don't have the language to talk about anti-racist work, don't have the language to talk about white supremacy, but they've had a host of experiences that actually are entrances for them. And so much of our work is about how do we create entrances and on-ramps for people, that when I talk to my aunt about Kavanaugh, I'm not saying to my aunt like, Roe v. Wade just isn't her entrance. It's just not that language is not the thing that gets her riled up. So with my aunt, I'm like, they trying to hide the papers from us. And she's like, DeRay, they hiding the papers? I'm like, girl, they hiding the papers. They are hiding them. And she's like, they can't hide. I'm like, you're right, they can't hide the papers. And then I'm saying to her, and he doesn't even believe in a woman's right to choose. And she's like, really? I'm like, that's crazy, right? And she's like, yes. But like part of it is as an organizer is not to be so arrogant that we believe that the way I enter is the only way that people can enter. That like for some people, like the police is a matter of fairness. It's not about sort of policing at all. In Austin, the Austin Justice Coalition got the whole Austin City Council to vote against a police union contract. We've never seen that happen before. It's really incredible. And one of the things that they did really well is like the Nurses Association came out against it. And the nurses like the police, but they were just like, these parts of it aren't fair, And in Austin, the contract literally says that 1, 2, and 3 day suspensions, like when officers get suspended for 1, 2, or 3 days, in their file, the suspension gets coded as a written reprimand. You're like, that's just crazy. Like, there's no scenario where that makes sense, right? So the nurses came out being like, this just isn't fair. And like part of our work is to like help people realize that like you can enter into the space however you enter. We just are trying to get to a place that changes the outcomes.
That's a great segue. So I wanted to talk about community, and you're very inclusive and want people to be, and you want people to come in from wherever they are. And I think when groups start getting a bit bigger, they start being a bit more selective, and they say, well, you're not representing me, or you're not welcome because you're talking about this from a different way. And when we were advertising on Facebook that you were going to be here, and we had people, well, he doesn't represent me, as though anyone was saying you did. How do you go about including everyone in the community, and so that they do have a voice and that they can participate?
Yeah, so like I said, I'm mindful that like for some people, I'm like a good entrance for them, and for some people I'm not, and I'm okay with that, right? It's like part of our work is to find like the best entrance for people. So there are some people who like, they are abolitionists, and they are like, we should end all prisons. Cool. There are other people who, they believe in decarceration. They're like, we should get as many people out as possible, but there's some things that are so problematic that like, we shouldn't lock people in cages, but they just gotta be separated from society. And like, both of those are legitimate sort of camps to be in, right? And part of our work is to like help people like figure out what camp they're in, and then like help them organize in that. That like when I think about what it means to be in a coalition says that we believe in the same like world at the end. We might not agree on like how to get there, but we generally agree on like what the end looks like, and like I'm okay with that. So when I think about this idea of like sort of one person who's the entrance or two people, it's like that's just not real. And what I loved about the protests in St. Louis is that we didn't have membership cards. We didn't have to sign up to be in somebody's chapter or something. Like we did the work because the work was important to us. And like that to me is the most authentic organizing, that I never confuse collective action for the work of organizations. I know a lot of organizations with big mailing lists who do nothing. I know a lot of people who don't have a 501c3 who've done a lot, right? And like I try to be mindful of what that looks like.
I've got two more questions for you. One is around this sort of dichotomy of it being easier to have the conversations and fight for things when you're anonymous or you're not known as the head of something. And you know, early yesterday we had a speaker who's working to promote environmentalism and low waste and reduce waste, no plastic, that sort of thing. At some point, she's going to get enough followers that they're like, oh, that's the plastic girl again. How do you deal with that? How do you get past those barriers where it's like, oh, DeRay's the whichever guy, the Black Lives Matter guy, the vest guy, the this guy? How do you deal with that? There's got to be there's a barrier there, right, to getting to talk to some people just because they know something about you.
Yeah, I don't know. You know, I've been asked a lot of questions in a lot of places. Nobody's ever asked me this, so that's interesting. You know, people definitely, when I walk into rooms, I ran for mayor in Baltimore in 2016, and before that, every single picture of me on the internet was like me with my fist up like this with a straight face. So I would walk into places and people were just like nervous. It's like, I'm not mean, those pictures just are, I don't know, I'm not smiling. So that's funny. You know, it is, so much of my life is like online, so I'll go to places sometimes and I went somewhere recently and they had all these plums and I'm like, oh my God, I love plums. And they're like, we know. And it's like, that's weird, right? Like, that's that's weird. I thought you just were great. And it's like, no, you were like stalking my timeline. In terms of the issues, you know, I definitely walk into rooms and people think that I'm gonna like talk about criminal justice and stuff. I am, and like that's real. These aren't the only issues that I care about, but they are really important to me. I am always trying to figure out like what are the connections between the other issues. So like the DUI thing is like interesting to me. There are a host of issues that I'm like, this is like really Flint. One of the interesting things about lead is that I didn't know this until recently, that lead is one of the reasons why kids eat lead paint, which maybe you know that I didn't know, is that lead is naturally sweet. And what makes that really insidious is that there's a period of time in this country where the housing administration mandated that all the paint in housing projects be lead-based paint. So there are generations of kids who grew up like eating paint chips, licking the walls, stuff like that, and their parents were told that they were like unfit parents because like, why is your kid eating the paint chips? But literally like the paint tastes like candy, and like if any of you have been around toddlers, they will eat anything that you'll let them eat, they'll eat. And like one of the wildest things about lead is not only is there no cure, but you think about one of the interesting things about Flint is that it's had the biggest decline in childhood literacy that we've ever actually recorded in this country, a 75% decline, which is wild. That's like so wild that it's like, I don't know how more people aren't talking about this. So like, how do we make those connections? Like I'm interested in those things, but it is a hard thing. You walk in and people are like, oh, there's the justice guy again, and you're like, okay. So that is weird. I will say too, like just today I tweeted something about a company because I had like a not great experience with this company this morning. And somebody like who's on the board of that company, I get this text me and like, DeRay, why did you tweet that? And I'm like, sorry. You know, like, so some days I do miss the being able to just sort of say what I want about whatever and then not be news or not be like a big deal. So I miss that sometimes.
Yeah, we had one of the a media outlet contact us and say, why would you invite someone from Black Lives Matter to a heroism conference? And I was like, what? Of course we would. You know, that it's about changing. So
I'll say very quickly. So I love Spotify's Discover Weekly. Like I'm a big fan. And every Monday I used to tweet like, love Discover Weekly, like just because I like it. And it got to a point that so many reporters were calling Spotify to get a public comment about their sponsorship of me that I know the people at Spotify now. It's like, I just like it, guys. Like I'm not getting paid to like it. I just think it's like dope. And like so it's funny that somebody reached out to you.
So the last question, you're doing really well at segueing for my questions, is Flint.
I didn't know these questions beforehand, guys. This is all...
So we have people from Flint in the audience, and we always have, and that's a really big part of this conference for me. I worked for the Flint YMCA for 12 years, and it's important to have them here. So thank you guys for getting down here today. So it's less about the issues that Flint is facing, but I wonder what your advice would be for a young person in Flint and of course broadly as well for anyone else in the audience, but what can they do to make change? How would you, what are some of those first steps for them to make change in the world around them?
Yeah, so I'd say like the three things that come to mind. One is that remember that the system isn't too complicated for you to understand. That one of the ways that the status quo like continues to play musical chairs with itself is that like they pretend that like all of this is so complicated that nobody can get it. And it's like, you know, if they could rewrite the tax code on the back of scrap paper, then we can actually do all of this in a generation, right? That like this tax code rewrite literally happened on scrap paper. People didn't read it and it passed. It's like you can actually learn all the things about bail or the pipes or like whatever it is. Like you can know these things and you can know them well. And I think there are a lot of gatekeepers still in the social justice space who sort of hoard knowledge around these issues. And like all of you can know as much as I know about mass incarceration of the police. Everybody can. So that's one. The second is that there are all these unexplored areas. So like follow your curiosity. So, you know, one of the things that we're about to organize on is if any of you have ever emailed somebody in prison, there are a couple big companies that manage the email system. And every time I send an email to this particular inmate, I have to buy an electronic stamp. I can only buy stamps in books. And the number of stamps that I have to buy is actually predicated on how long the email is, which is like the biggest scam I've ever seen. You're like, scam, scam, scam. And like those sort of things are like wild. And like, how do you make sure that you put yourself in place where you can like ask the questions about how the system works so that like you can uncover these things that people just aren't talking about? And the third thing is this thing about imagination, that we'll have to figure out how to build something better, that freedom isn't only the absence of oppression, but it's the presence of justice and joy. And we spend so much of our time trying to get rid of the bad things, which we should, because the bad things are bad. We don't spend a lot of time thinking about how do we build up the good things. And like we can free everybody from prison tomorrow, and that doesn't mean that the world is automatically just. Like we will still have to build something that is just. And don't forget to like imagine. So when I think about the imagining, it's like, what if when you see kids on the corner, you think they're like being unruly? What if there were like after school providers that just like drove around cities and were like, hey, come do this? Like that's like a crazy notion, but possible. You know, what if when every kid was born in poverty in cities, we gave them a set of library books from birth to senior year in high school because we knew that literacy was important, and this was one of the ways that our commitment showed up. Like we could do all of these things that are seemingly wild, like we could actually do them, but it'll take people like engaging in like the big act of imagination, like the big asks, like the biggest way that we can think about the world to bring it about.
That's a great way to end, I think. DeRay, thank you for making the world or dreaming the world. Thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for being here. Round of applause for DeRay McKesson. Thank you.
Woo! Cool. We did it.
The Hero Roundtables are the global events that ask the question, what is a hero? You've just seen one hero talk. To find more and join the conversation, visit our website or social media.